This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter, sir.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show. Well, today, Peter, I'm really excited because guess what? We are heading to New York and we're going to talk to Colm Tóibín, the writer. He's just published his new collection of poetry, his debut collection. It's called Vinegar Hill. It's published by Carcanet Press and it's going to be really exciting to talk to him about this new book of poems. So the coffee's made.
The toast is on.
And the books are on the table.
September. The first September of the pandemic, the skies are watercolour, white and grey, and Pembroke Street is empty and so is Leeson Street. This is the time after time, what the world will look like when the world is over, when people have been ushered into seats reserved for them in the luminous heavens. Moving towards the corner of Upper Pembroke Street and Leeson Street, an elderly man wears a mask. His walk is sprightly, his movements brisk. It catches watery eye for a watery moment. Without stopping, all matter of fact, he says, "Someone told me you were dead."
I do love that last line. And that was Colm Tóibín reading September, the very first poem in his new and debut collection of poetry, Vinegar Hill, just published by Carcanet Press. Essayist, novelist, short story writer, playwright, memoirist, Colm Tóibín is one of the finest writers at work today, one of wit, one of compassion, one of intelligence, whose work spans several decades. He's the author of 10 novels, 2 collections of stories. He has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize 3 times, and he's won the Costa Novel of the Year and the Los Angeles Times Novel of the Year. Colm is the Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of Humanities at Columbia University and Chancellor of Liverpool University. His work has been translated into more than 30 languages. In 2021, he was awarded the David Cohen Prize, and just this year, in 2022, he was made the new laureate for Irish fiction, taking over from Sebastian Barry. And it's recently been announced that Colm Tóibín has won the Rathbones Folio Prize for The Magician, his fictionalised biography of the writer Thomas Mann. One of the judges, Rachel Long, said that after reading 80 books during the judging process, Colm Tóibín's novel made her fall in love with reading all over again. Nice praise indeed, and huge congratulations, Colm.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And so to Colm's debut collection of poetry, Vinegar Hill, which Peter and I are delighted to talk to Colm today about at our breakfast table. It's a wide-ranging, memorable collection of poems. Subjects include growing up in Enniscorthy, Dublin life, travels in Spain, Venice, America, living through COVID, illness, reflections on art and artists. These are vivid poems, astutely observed, shot through with genuine humour, emotion, flashes of memory, alerting us to what it is to be alive on the earth, what it is to be human. Of this new collection of poems, Michael Schmidt, publisher of Carcanet Press, said, "These poems are wonderful disclosures about language, the poetic tradition, and a life lived to the full." Well, Colm Tóibín, you're very welcome to Books for Breakfast. And what a week you were having. The Rathbones Prize announcement, the launch of your poetry book, all falling at the same time for you. You must be feeling very, very happy indeed, Colm.
Yeah, I'd better not go on with that too long. It doesn't lead to anything good, really. Better just go back to work, really.
Just to start off with, Colm, I suppose you're mainly known clearly as a writer of prose, but also clearly poetry is a great love of yours. And we were at the Carcanet launch of Vinegar Hill, and you were saying that you wrote poems from 12 to around 20, and that you kind of stopped around then. And I suppose those are pretty intense years. I mean, it's a time that a lot of writers and poets are starting out on the artistic journey. So I'm kind of interested in the fact that you set aside poetry at that time. And I'm equally interested in the fact that then you came back to it, I suppose, around 30 years later. And I suppose the question then arising from that is what made you stop writing poetry and what made you come back to it?
I mean, there was nothing deliberate about it. It was a sort of drift. What happened was that, if you're a student, it means you're spending a lot of time alone where you're meant to be reading. And so all of those years between the ages of 12 and 20, I was in that position where I was in a room on my own and something would come and I would write it. What happened in those 8 years also was I couldn't find a tone. I couldn't get what they call a voice. I don't mean a personal voice as much as I couldn't relax my tone enough to get a poem. It was all looked like striving, looked like someone trying to write a poem. There was no poem there. And I couldn't work it out. And the more I tried, the less it worked. And students, as I think particularly at that age when you're 18 and 19 and you're devouring poetry, there's a sort of brutality about the place too, over who's no good, or whose whose new poem isn't it. There's a lot of judgment being made. And what was extraordinary in that period, I'm talking about 1974, 75, was the extraordinary confidence that Aidan Carl Matthews, who was a contemporary of mine, had. Those early poems of his just seemed so made and so ironic, and just so, he seemed so natural in his talent. And certainly when New Weather arrived, New Weather was a bit of a shock because it was just so smart, and the poems could be obscure and then absolutely rigidly meaningful, and he could play with anything he wanted. And so there was a lot of good poetry being written by people of my age. It wasn't just that Heaney was doing it or Ivan Boland or something. There was a lot of people. You looked at the dates and it was, oh my God, Aidan Carl Matthews is actually younger than me.
Yeah.
And there was Jared Fanning, and there was a poet called Patrick King who died young, but who had a pamphlet with Honest Ulsterman, and he was around it. I was just, it was awful because no one wanted my poems. And then what happened is I went to Spain, and I didn't have in Spain those hours alone where I was meant to be studying. I was teaching, and I was drinking, and I was going to concerts, so that it wasn't as though there were that quiet time every day where something could come. So I drifted into not doing it. But I suppose I was slightly encouraged by the fact there was no great demand for a new poem from me. It wasn't as though my readers were waiting, and so I just drifted away from it. And it was disappointing because I think I also, maybe like a lot of people, saw myself as a poet before I wrote the poems. and that's awful.
And then coming back into the writing of it.
Yeah, that what happened would be there would be, discovery of a new poet, say, but also just sticking with the books that I had loved then and trying to just become more involved with someone like Tom Gunn, for example, just reading over and over and trying to make sense of the thing more. And as I began to write about books, certainly writing about Gunn, writing about Elizabeth Bishop, I got a lot of pleasure out of that. And I would tend to buy most books of poetry coming out. What's interesting I found was that I followed the Irish thing very closely, that if it was a new Irish poet, I would be in there straight away with the poems. And in the same way as other people I knew were following sport, with the same sort of intensity, I was following poetry. I wrote one that was 30 years, but really where there was, nothing. And when I finished The Master, which is a novel about Henry James, it was a big book and there was a lot of rewriting. Funny, these little poems, some of which are in this book, almost abstract. And I love the idea of trying to make them more and more abstract. While I knew what the image was, I knew what it was about, but that I didn't have to explain, I didn't have to announce it. So there are more of those poems, but we just included a few of them. And I think by the time the pandemic came, I had maybe 25. And I loved the idea. It was like being a Japanese poet, I write 1.5 poems a year, and there's 6 lines each, and it was a sort of joke. And funny thing then, when I had cancer, I was on a lot of steroids, which grind inside you and sort of keep certain things going. But you had about an hour of pure clarity every day. And I didn't use it properly. But then eventually I discovered that if you worked on something that was emotionally affecting you, you could get extraordinary levels of intensity in a line that also, anyway, there was an effortlessness as well. And so I wrote 2 or 3 poems at that time. And they're the ones that John McAuliffe saw that Colette Bryce published in Poetry Ireland Review. I just sent on a whim. It wasn't as though I was ever sending anything out. I sent a few things to the TLS, but anyway, John was very encouraging, and then the pandemic began. And something else happened that I'm not sure about, but the sort of chemo that I was on for cancer affects your hearing, and it can make you deaf. So I had to go and get a base test to see where my hearing was before I started the treatment. But what it did to me was it seemed to improve my hearing. It improved my memory of melody, so that if I was listening to music in the morning, in the afternoon, I could more or less remember it. And it would come into my head like an earworm, over and over, a line of a song or a melody. And I wonder if that sort of opening up of an aural, A-U-R-A-L sort of thing actually freed me in some funny way with sound. And then the pandemic started, and I was in Los Angeles, and my boyfriend, my partner, he was involved in a few book clubs and writing groups and stuff. So at 6 o'clock every day, he would go off with his friends, and I could hear them Zooming in the other room. And I was sort of left there, and if I had a thought, I couldn't share it with him because he was busy. And that's when then this started. I mean, it was unexpected, and it was every day. And I was either revising or anything would occur to me, I would write down. First lines were all nonsense. And then I would let it go and get it go to see where it would take me. And it was a bit of a surprise. Yeah.
That's a fascinating account. I mean, I was thinking as well, because, kind of coming to poetry from, the background of prose, I was thinking of, poetry is not fiction. I mean, obviously, and like Margaret Atwood, who's done both, once said that poetry is a different area of the brain from prose, much closer to music and mathematics, she said. And I was thinking also of Tom McCarthy, whose journals have recently been published, and who was a guest on this podcast. I know you've been devouring his journals with interest as well. But he said, think of the poem as the essence of any described experience. Don't tell stories, but create telling effects. Poetry is not fiction. And I wondered, did you find it hard to put aside your experience as a prose writer and to take on the task of writing poems, or was there a kind of seamless enough transition between the two forms?
I didn't think about it. It wasn't a problem. In a way, it was a relief sometimes. The business of prose is that you get an idea and it moves into melody, into rhythm, even if the rhythm is buried. But that doesn't happen again. So all you have to do then is work. And it's really drudgery every day, because you have to keep it going. Where they went, what they did, where they were, who, where, when, how, the sort of map of the moment. And with this, it was like, there's something else important here. I've got to tell you that I never kept drafts of anything. I work in longhand in fiction. With this, I worked on the machine, on the laptop, and I didn't keep drafts. In other words, if a line just didn't work, it was gone, and there was no record of it. And so it was like a sort of action painting where if anything isn't working in any given moment, it goes, and the decision to take it out is great because it's never going to be there again. And so you're always working towards a single finished thing without all the other drafts being in any way apparent and not even available to you. So if you take something out, you can't even find it. And that created for me a huge excitement. The idea that you didn't have anything crossed out or anything left from earlier versions. And so you were all the time making only one thing. I don't know why this is so important, but it mattered to me.
That's kind of terrifying, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's great, because you really said, that line I'll never get it back if I do this. I'm going to do it now. Kill it. And so the other thing would be that the silliest thought is no use in a novel. You can't really put silly thoughts into novels, but if you have a thought that, Maeve Binchy, I did really, driving along the car, listen to Maeve Binchy's evening class, which was being broadcast on RTE. And I thought, I wish I could have that ease that Maeve has with really fantastic plot. And so I just had that thought, Maeve, and I thought, why don't I just see what I would do if I had Maeve, one of those ideas in Maeve? So I just had that silly thought, what if I were Maeve, or if I had Maeve's ideas? What would I do with that? Then I started to make these other women who were Italian teachers in Dublin. I made 3 more, just on a whim, just whimsy, and trying to then make the whimsy solid. But it's completely different to writing fiction, where you really can't deal with a sudden thought. But this idea of sudden thought, of any memory, anything sometimes, the most odd memory could make a poem. And what you had to do with it was let go, see where it would lead you, and realize you had the rest of the evening for this purpose, that there was the pandemic, there was nothing else going to happen. So that was very useful.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, Colm, like it was a time of great liberation. You were setting aside a particular way of writing in prose, and then you were taking on board this new, fresh way of writing through poetry. So it must have been a very liberating, happy time for you, because I suppose that's the exhilaration you get when a poem falls on a page. But you started off by reading September. Many of these poems were written during the pandemic and when you were being treated for cancer. It's a catastrophic time, both globally and personally. In the poem Eccles Street, you're in the Mater Hospital and you say the steroids are thumping through you. In the poem Los Angeles, there's the horror of the fires taking place. Water was scarce and the sun burnished the paintings in the Getty. And in your poem Small Wonder, you're in Venice during the pandemic. And I'm just wondering, did you find that this strange time of illness, of fires, of pandemic demanded of you a response in poetry as opposed to a response in prose?
No, I mean, it's complicated. You see, the cancer was over by the time of the pandemic, and the sort of prognostication was sort of good in that the chemo seemed to have worked. And I went back to work. I went back to teaching. And when the pandemic came, a lot of people had a very bad time, and I didn't. And it was a very happy time because what we'd always talked about, myself and my partner, just being together and just having nothing else. No one was calling around. I was doing no readings. There was nothing. And there's the two of us there, and we became very content. So that the poems are actually written, oddly enough, in a time of pure contentment. And all the things I'm always complaining about, just I had nothing to complain about. And I didn't mind. I obviously hearing it'd be better if it hadn't happened, the pandemic. But I certainly have nothing to complain about. And these poems were written in a very peaceful, easy, contented time.
Yeah, I remember that Peter and I at the time were living here in Dublin, and I remember that kind of quiet stillness of the city and walking around the quiet squares, Merrion Square, Fitzwilliam Square during that time.
Yeah, I think some writers say they couldn't work, but I think a lot of writers had a nice time.
And talking about Dublin, it's very much at the heart of many of your poems, isn't it? We heard in the opening poem, it's there, it's the contemporary city, but it's also in your book, the Dublin of various pasts. It's the Dublin of Manley Hopkins and John Butler Yeats. But it's also the more recent past, isn't it, of the city as a map of dead cinemas. You talk about the Astor, the Academy, the Regent, the Screen, the Green, and it's also the Dublin of gay experience. And it got me thinking of the poet Roy Fisher, who said, "Birmingham is what I think with." And so clearly, I think, Colm, Dublin is more than a place that you just happen to inhabit. It's importantly a place that your imagination really thrives on, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose that the time I was writing these poems was a time when I wasn't going to be in Dublin. And Dublin was a memory. Dublin was becoming lost. And things that happened in the 70s, like those cinemas, the Grafton and Love in the Afternoon and Bergman films. And it was before art house began as a concept. So, yeah, I'd never managed to write a novel about Dublin, a novel set in Dublin. And so, yeah, here it came as though I needed Dublin to be lost or not available to me. So images of it could come and I could start working with that. And I did have in my mind, one of the poems could have been a story, but I couldn't get a proper shape for the story, which is that on that Saturday, that the great day of the same-sex marriage referendum results, and the yard of Dublin Castle and Miss Panty and everybody in a high state of excitement, and Leo and Ursula Halligan, and everyone was gay. So I realized that, of course, it came too late for people, including people of my generation, who just, gay culture is such a youth culture, and especially if you're a man. and men in their 50s and 60s just are not part of that. And there was a joke, I didn't put it into the poem, but that the George, the bar, the gay bar in Dublin, has a disco upstairs and a pretty busy bar that feeds onto the street. But there's an old bar still left there from before. It's like a little railway carriage. And that's called Jurassic. And that's where men of my age would just drink pints of Guinness, looking straight ahead of them, wondering what hit them, with all these twinks wandering about looking gorgeous. And I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about maybe a story about that day, but I couldn't get a shape for the story. I couldn't get, it would just illustrate a point. But once it became possible as a sort of narrative poem, where the two guys would just walk through the city, visiting all the places that they knew in the 70s that were gay places that I knew as well, cruising grounds or, various places where you could meet people. That became possible as a poem. And it was very exciting because I realized that I really did have my own map of Dublin. Those cinemas, that gay world, that I had at Dublin was all mine, and that no one else really much had as we were all getting older. There were people who just wouldn't know any of that.
It's funny because that was actually what the poem I was going to ask you about next, which was the Dublin Saturday 23rd of May 2015, because I think that it's very interesting, and you've just described it as that kind of thing of, you have this kind of extraordinary moment in the kind of recent history of the city, but it's from the point of view of the two gay men who are almost 60, and they're kind of looking back to a kind of, I suppose, a riskier and more secretive kind of time. And all those pubs that you mentioned, like Rice's and Bartley Dunn's and the Gym and the George, and the kind of casual encounters and all of that kind of thing. But it's almost a sense that this new liberal Ireland has come a little bit too late for that sort of generation. There's a kind of a sadness about their stroll around the Dublin as they kind of reinvent the past or remember the past for themselves. It's very interesting sense of that kind of removal from the joy of that particular moment.
Yeah, I suppose it's out of some script. There's a big celebration going on, and there are two Dublin fellas at the edge of it saying the arse. In other words, it's really out of the city's culture that there'd be two fellas just standing there, not impressed.
Yeah.
Well, Colm, you grew up in Enniscorthy, County Wexford, near Vinegar Hill, the site, as we all know, of the famous battle between Irish rebels and British forces in 1798. And so the title of your book, it actually got me thinking of Seamus Heaney's poem, Requiem for the Croppies, the pockets of their greatcoats filled with barley. The pockets of their greatcoats filled with barley, he says. They buried us without shroud or coffin, and in August the barley grew up out of our grave. Heaney's sonnet is a requiem for these boys and the lives that they've given in defence of Ireland. But your own poem is a far more personalised response to the hill, which you could see from your house where you grew up, couldn't you? And there is the persistence of history at play here. But it's also inspired by your own childhood. It's also inspired by a memory of your own mother who painted the hill, isn't it?
Seamus had a very good joke, which he told at readings before he would read this poem, that he went to Wexford and he was driving around, I think in his Volkswagen at the time, and he went to Boulavogue, but he couldn't quite find it. And he stopped a man and said, I'm looking for Boulavogue. And the man looked at him and said, Father Murphy. And the man said, well, now he's not there now. Or he's not there anymore. Yeah. And Seamus thought this was marvellous. But you see, I suppose the difference is that for a lot of people like Seamus Heaney brought up in the nationalist ballads, it's a symbol, it stands for something. But if you're from Enniscorthy, there's an actual houses called Vinegar Hill Villas. And you could talk about Vinegar Hill, that's where the town reservoir is, so that it has a practical day-to-day presence. But the thing is, no matter what you do sometimes, that summer of 1798, and the fact that the hill was where the place the rebels held, it's become more complicated in recent years as historians have started to work on actually what happened up there in the weeks the rebels held the place. In other words, people were tortured and murdered. But of course, it was a foolish place to hold. They knew nothing about strategy. It wasn't as though they had prepared this rebellion. And to find yourself on top of a hill, with the British forces coming with their cannons, that they can just surround you. And so it was really tragic that they were up there at all. It was the last place they should have been. And But there again, it was glorious in some way. You know, it was for later writers. And then there was one exit called Needham's Gap. And so the poem is trying to tease out the whole idea of looking at it as a thing, that it actually is a piece of rock, and what it looks like, because it's from our house, the sun comes up just behind it. So in the morning, it's sort of grayish because the sun is behind it. And then, of course, as the day goes on, you can see it in different ways. So I was thinking about that as a purely visual experience, what it is like. But then, no matter what you do, you know, the idea of surrender, the idea of being surrounded really comes in and won't go away. So it's a sort of trying to just tease out all that.
Yeah, and it's a poem which is also about the colour and the texture of the hill, and of course your mother painting it. And it's beautiful as well, I think, Colm, that her painting is actually on the cover of the book. It's such a lovely thing to have there.
Yeah. I think everyone in Enniscorthy's had a go at painting it, and there are some lovely paintings of it by Tony O'Malley.
Well, speaking about your mother painting Vinegar Hill, there are poems about your parents in this book too, many of which are really moving, such as the beautiful poem 2+1. And it would be really lovely, Colm, to hear you read that poem now.
Yeah, this poem is called 2+1. My heart is watching and weakening, mercilessly counting the beats. It is bored, casually waiting for this to cease. My father died at 53. Vessels leaked in his brain. Then arteries weakened. He moaned in pain. My mother's eyes were grey as his were blue. Her breath rose high over the town before it sank in death. I have their two weak hearts in one weak heart. Their eyes merged in my gaze. His slow smile, her soft side glance, oversee my days.
Oh, thank you, Colm, for that. Actually, listening to you there, it reminded me of a poem by R.S. Thomas as well. There's a beautiful elegance to your poem. Isn't there, Peter, beautiful elegance to that poem?
Yeah, there's a real poignancy about it as well.
Yeah, you can use those short lines, you know, after the long ones. You can sort of get a thing. But I mean, sometimes, as you both know, something comes as a little gift where you realize oversee, because I'm talking about gaze, eyes, I'm talking about glance. And then I suddenly get the word oversee, which you can sort of play with the word. I mean, it's oversee, meaning the see is more important than the over, but then oversee is also means sort of monitor, look after. So you get a gift like that, where just something odd comes into your head. You say, oh my God, this is good. Whatever word was there before, thank God it's gone forever. You know, you can oversee.
One of the things as well, I mean, there's a lot of humor in the book. I mean, there's poems of great. Some of them inspired by the nuns and bishops. Quite a few nuns and bishops in the book. I mean, there's the bishop, for instance, who dies during the visit of John F. Kennedy to Wexford, and the news of his death is withheld until after JFK has left Wexford. Then there's the one about the nuns who are finally given permission to learn how to drive in Vatican. Your poem Vatican II, and then there's the one where it's kind of a comic poem about your mother, and it starts off your brother is kind of wondering whether nuns wear shoes, and then someone gets the idea that your mother should dress up as a nun and to visit the house and surprise and trick your brother. There's this great scene where he's sitting kind of looking at this nun and thinking that she's a bit familiar but not quite figuring it out. So it's kind of it's funny, but it's a sad poem as well, because obviously because your brother and mother are dead now, and it took a long time. I mean, the last time you say they were both dressed up for good, but that story came back to you many, many years later, sort of out of the blue. And I was thinking, I mean, first, is humor important? And the other thing is, do poems often surprise you like that, coming out of the blue like that? I mean,
the first thing is that when I'm talking about that, writing poems between 12 and 20, I couldn't have done that a sort of relaxed meter, bringing with it a sort of relaxed response to things. And Elizabeth Bishop was helpful in that she said, a poem should be true. Just make sure that, it's true. So that if there's an emotion in the poem described, it must not be exaggerated or more than it was. So when I'm in that poem, I'm trying to realize that I can't connect that nun, my mother dressed up as a nun, and my brother watching her, with anything. It's just that. It isn't as though I can say, and that I can make sense of it, or it means something, or it connects to both of them being dead. I can't. And in a way, writing that down is really liberating, where I'm saying, I'm not trying to make a poem. I'm trying to actually say something true. But also make sure that the hilarity of the general occasion is included. That you say various things about, she's home from the missions, and the way her glasses being on, and but also you guys weren't alive when this happened, but it really was an extraordinary thing when nuns were allowed drive, and it was added enormously to the general texture of life in Enniscorthy when the presentation nuns, who everyone knew, was suddenly to be found in a car, and the car shuddering its way through the town with poor old Sister Mother Delurd, like just trying to deal with the whole clutch issue. And honestly, it was a completely big event. And the minute that came into my head, like I'm in Los Angeles, I'm wandering around the house, for some reason that comes into my head, and I realized, just started by saying, just write down a fact. Like if Vatican II nuns were suddenly allowed to drive, just write that down as a fact. Don't put anything else in, and just see where that might take you about nuns. and again, I can find nothing really symbolic about it. It was just that the Pope didn't want, they weren't thinking carefully, say which nuns should be allowed to drive, which would have really, I think, helped. And then I get a line, the devil is in the detail. And I just can't resist it. I mean, I probably should have taken it out. It's too cheesy, but the devil is in the detail. Anyway, you need to restrain yourself sometimes. And maybe I failed a bit to do that in the book.
Yeah, I think it was so funny. You say in the poem, no amount of prayer could teach Mother Superior to use the clutch. And then, of course, the poem ends with the line that it was the young nuns who should be at the wheel. So I think they got it all wrong, didn't they, Colm?
And I think maybe it is a symbolic poem. I mean, they really got everything wrong at Vatican II. They mixed up the whole, they thought, moving from Latin to English, moving the altar around was enough. And of course it wasn't.
And that's a long poem, Vatican II, and it tells a story. And it brings me back to the idea that we started off saying that poetry is not fiction. And yet, Colm, so many of your poems tell stories. I was a bit jealous about your poem where you talked about your Dublin house that you abandoned and you left behind so you could go and live in Spain for a whole year.
The house in Stony Batter, yeah. I did. I just walked out of it. I just every so often it would occur to me, I wonder, have the Irish Nationwide taken it back yet? And I just thought, if I behave responsibly this year, I'm going to not be able to go to Spain. So I just thought, I don't have enough money to go to Spain and pay the mortgage, and the house is in such a state of mess. There's no chance of renting it out. Like it had an outside toilet, and so I thought, honestly, it had an outside toilet, and so I couldn't have rented it out. So I just actually behaved really irresponsibly. Yeah, but the technical thing in that was I found, that I worked out a system, which is lovely sort of formalist thing where the last word of every second, the second line of every stanza is house. And then there's an off rhyme at the very last. So just sometimes that happens once and you see it and you think, oh, I'm going to make that happen every time and see if I can get the words right.
And then there's the poem about you being jumped on by special branchman on the canal between Baggot Street and Leeson Street because they mistook you for a terrorist, didn't they?
Yeah, that happened, yeah. And I think that was part of the time. It was about 1975 and the branch were out of control in Dublin. And they just jumped on me for it.
You are carrying a book of poems, I think.
It was a volume of Keats. It was a volume of Keats. I mean, there was nothing worse. I was walking up from someone's house in Pembroke Road to my place in Hatch Street along the canal with my volume of Keats. God, special branch.
And then there's the poem about you sailing on the ship, the Estonia. And that's the ship that sank the following year, wasn't it? Between Stockholm and Tallinn.
Yeah. And I was actually on Joe Duffy that day talking about something. And Joe said, what was it like, that ship? I mean, did you, and I was, that question made me think, God, what was that night actually like? And then all those years, the idea came back to me that I had been there, and soon afterwards I had been in Australia when the two people were missing at the Great Barrier Reef. But I was trying to think, anytime anything about the sea comes in, I'll entertain it for as long as I can.
I mean, just listening to you there, Colm, I'm wondering, Do you believe that storytelling is central to the art of poetry?
Storytelling? No. I absolutely don't. And there's a problem if you're a novelist and you're Irish, in that people think you're a storyteller, and they think you got it from some granny, that the oral tradition came down from, the Irish you're so marvelous at telling stories, the Irish. And I just think about home, and uncle or something, who didn't speak at all much, who just sit there grumpy. And, it wasn't as though the house it wasn't like that. And so, it's lovely saying sometimes, well, actually, I'm a literary novelist, if you don't mind. And you can keep your storyteller, for if you watch it in Yorkshire or somewhere. I tend to love poems that go nowhere, that start from nowhere. I mean, it isn't that poetry makes nothing happen, but it's the opposite. It is the lovely idea that nothing makes poetry happen, and that a poem comes out of nothing, and that it's led by language, and that you're following it for that reason. The problem I had was that this failed me. In other words, these poems are anecdotes. They're based on things that happened, and they're sometimes far too much explanation at the beginning of where, who, when, that I don't trust it enough to go into the middle of the experience. I start at the beginning as though I'm involved in some sort of narrative competition. To say this, the middle, the beginning, the middle, and the end. So I'm going to have to really fight against that tendency to be too explicit and too sort of clunkily flat-footed. I tend to love poems that go nowhere, that start from nowhere. I mean, it isn't that poetry makes nothing happen, but it's the opposite. It is the lovely idea that nothing makes poetry happen, and that a poem comes out of nothing, and that it's led by language, and that you're following it for that reason. The problem I had was that this failed me. In other words, these poems are anecdotes. They're based on things that happened, and they're sometimes far too much explanation at the beginning of where, who, when, that I don't trust it enough to go into the middle of the experience. I start at the beginning as though I'm involved in some sort of narrative competition. To say this, the middle, the beginning, the middle, and the end. So I'm going to have to really fight against that tendency to be too explicit and too sort of clunkily flat-footed. And so, no, I mean, I think that I love a poem that's abstract. I mean, Wallace Stevens, it must be abstract. But there's nothing nicer than an abstract poem that holds you with its rhythms, and you're not quite sure what's going on. And I failed to do that in this book, and it's a disgrace.
I don't think you failed at all, Colm. In fact, you definitely didn't. It kind of reminds me, listening to you there, of a poet like Eleni Quillinan, quite a mysterious poet, and I always love entering the world of her poems. I may not know exactly what she's talking about, but it's a really wonderful space to be in. But I think we've kind of we're reaching the end now, Colm, but I do want to ask you about your poem, Prayer to St. Agnes. You say to her, "O martyr and saint, let life be dull and make our verse unadorned, and let next year's poems be plainfully full of signs that lessons have been learned." It's a poem in which you want to be cured of metaphor, you want to write clear and clean lines. So Colm, I'm just wondering, have your prayers been answered in this, your debut book of poems?
I have it in for the word like. I have it in for simile, but there are some similes in the book. But, nothing is quite like anything. And I suppose a lot of this is taken from Bishop. She's always correcting herself. That some bird, the swallows maybe have come back. Are others like them? And you go, are others like them? You mean they're dead? The ones they haven't come back, in fact. And so you can get a sort of by not. I mean, she's very good because she has a bird swimming in a lake, and the water behind is like a scissors opening. Well, that's pretty good, like a scissors opening, the water in the wake. But in general, I was trying to say that I found it very useful sometimes to look at someone like William Carlos Williams and to look at the way he would just write a fact down, and that there would be no metaphor and there would be no simile and there would be nothing except the thing. I mean, he said that, not ideas, but the thing itself. I found that very helpful in that I didn't have to make a poem. I just had to write down something that was true, using a sort of rhythm that at least pleased me, and that there wasn't a poem to be made from this. that you just merely tried another line to say something else that was true. And so I appealed to St. Agnes. I just picked her out of the blue. I thought I liked that St. Agnes. There's no reason why it's St. Agnes. And I prayed to her for just guidance on the whole business of metaphor and the whole business of poetry and just trying to keep things simple, and then, of course, once you keep things simple, you get afraid that it's just a sort of managed prose. And you've got to, maybe I'll do a prayer next to St. Martin or something, asking me, stop writing prose. This is poetry. Start counting the syllables, you Egypt.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's great to end this conversation with the word Egypt, isn't it? Which is very Irish indeed way of concluding an interview. But we began this conversation with the first poem in the book, September. And I was just thinking there, Colm, it might be great to finish with you reading the last poem in your book called Because the Night, which is an elegiac dream poem full of ghosts, a dead friend, a poem in memory of your parents, the places you lived in Dublin, Harcourt Street and Hatch Street. It's a really, I think, a wonderful poem really to end this collection at. And it would be great if you would read it now, Colm. I'd love to hear it, and so would Peter, I'm sure.
Yeah, this is just again this idea of just when you get to my age, sleep becomes a big thing where you don't sleep as much as you did and you need sleep and you're not getting it. And then suddenly you can get an extraordinary night where 3 nights or you haven't been sleeping and then you just go into this baby sleep. And I was thinking about this because I was having it. This is what was happening. And you also get to the age where, people are snoring, you get to the snore age. And we were sitting outside and there were people having lunch, and in the middle of the lunch, I got this opening, which might not seem much to anyone, but the poem couldn't have been written unless I got this 3 lines at the opening, which is not sleeping, and then a night's hard sleep. And I ran in, and wrote it down. And then I knew when everyone had gone, I would now have what I was looking for. But I didn't know exactly where it would lead me, but this is where it led me. So this is the last poem in the book. It's called Because the Night. Not sleeping, and then a night's hard sleep. Waking unsure which room I'm in. My old friend gone 2 years. Was there last night sitting at a table, fully himself. I know he is dead. Even in the dream I knew this. And yet I talked to him about ordinary things, not how he died or where he is. Sometimes my mother floats in, or my brothers, less often my father, who died long before they did. And then the old room in Hatch Street, or the top floor of number 2 Harcourt Terrace, where I lived years ago. Come back as though I still keep stuff in them, but have stopped paying the rent and must sneak in and out because someone is under orders to waylay me. Soon I will have to try and rescue books and clothes, get back the music that echoes here, especially on nights when you snore and I move into the study and sleep in the daybed. And when I wake, I have no clue where I am, what bed this is. But I will get up and find you, alive, real, now. And the morning starts, emails, the newspaper. I carry the night all day, though, a flight path, the way through.
Ah, great stuff. And that was Colm Tóibín reading from and talking about Vinegar Hill, his debut poetry collection just published by Carcanet Press. And as usual, all details will be available on www.booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And it just remains for me to say, Colm Tóibín, many thanks for coming in today to the breakfast table.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, both of you.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley and I have Peter Sarah here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And yeah, so
we'll be back again.
Podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And yeah, so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.